Ethan Miles and Victor Harper never imagined that a stranger smiling in nothing but underwear would turn their quiet town into a nightmare, gunning them down in 2 days and leaving Ridgewood trembling in fear. The sleepy town of Ridgewood had always been the kind of place where life moved slowly, where neighbors knew each other by name, and the biggest worry was whether the local diner had fresh pies that morning. The streets were lined with modest homes, trimmed lawns, and flowering trees that gave the town a picture-perfect appearance. People left their doors unlocked, trusting that nothing bad could happen in a place so calm and ordinary. But that sense of safety shattered on an early spring morning, leaving the community in shock and disbelief. It began with a sudden, terrifying sound that echoed across the usually quiet neighborhood, a series of gunshots that cut through the air like lightning. Residents who had stepped outside to enjoy the mild weather froze, their hearts pounding as they tried to understand what was happening. At first, it was hard to believe. Who would bring such violence to their town? Who could act so recklessly and without reason? When neighbors rushed to their windows, they saw a scene that no one could have anticipated. A man lay sprawled in his driveway, lifeless, a small pool of blood spreading around him. But it wasn't just the act of murder that left people horrified. The shooter had been unlike anyone they had ever imagined, a figure in nothing but underwear, his face twisted into an eerie, unsettling smile as he disappeared down the street. The sight of someone committing such a brutal act, stripped to the minimum and smiling while doing it, created a deep sense of unease. It was almost as if he wasn't even human, as if he existed outside the boundaries of normal society. People who witnessed it described a surreal moment, one that would haunt them for years. There was no robbery, no argument, no apparent motive. Nothing was taken. Nothing explained why a stranger would target an ordinary man and end his life with such cold detachment. Police officers who arrived at the scene were faced with chaos and panic. They cordoned off the area, taking in every detail, but the mystery seemed impenetrable. Residents whispered among themselves, sharing theories and fears. Was this the work of a madman, a criminal out for attention, or something far more sinister, someone who took pleasure in terrorizing a community that had once felt so safe? The town quickly became a hive of anxiety. Families barred their doors, children were kept inside, and local businesses struggled to function under the weight of collective fear. Every stranger, every shadow, every late-night sound sparked suspicion. Rumors spread as quickly as the news itself, each one more terrifying than the last. The image of the smiling man in underwear lingered in everyone's mind, etched with a clarity that made sleep difficult for many. Ridgewood's quiet streets, once symbols of comfort and simplicity, were now filled with tension and mistrust. People wondered if life would ever return to normal, if the streets they had walked safely for decades had become something unrecognizable overnight. Authorities worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and questioning anyone who might have seen the shooter or known the victim. Yet the answers remained elusive, and the lack of explanation only deepened the town's fear. Ridgewood had been transformed in a single morning. A place of safety turned into a stage for a horrifying and inexplicable act of violence. And while the town tried to cling to normalcy, the memory of that day and the image of a grinning killer in underwear would remain forever etched in the collective consciousness of everyone who had lived through it. The horror of the first day had barely begun to settle when Ridgewood was struck again, and this time the sense of safety that lingered like a fragile thread was completely severed. Just 24 hours after the first shooting, the town was thrown into renewed panic. News spread quickly, carried by anxious neighbors and social media, that another man had been gunned down in a nearby neighborhood under circumstances that mirrored the first crime in every terrifying detail. The initial shock of a single senseless killing had transformed into a pattern, and the reality that someone was roaming freely, committing murders seemingly at random, sent waves of fear crashing through the community. The second victim was discovered in the late afternoon, lying motionless on the sidewalk in front of his modest home. Neighbors reported hearing gunshots again, followed by silence and then the hurried footsteps of someone fleeing. Witnesses described the same chilling image they had shared from the first shooting. A man wearing only underwear, a wide, unsettling grin stretched across his face as he vanished into the shadows. The description alone was enough to paralyze the town with terror. It was no longer possible to imagine this as an isolated incident or a one-time act of madness. The smiling killer had struck twice, and the randomness of the attacks left everyone on edge. Fear quickly took hold of Ridgewood. Families huddled together in their homes, locking doors and windows, checking on neighbors who lived alone. Children were kept indoors, and parents avoided errands, afraid of encountering the killer in the open streets. Local authorities increased patrols, trying to reassure the public, but even the presence of uniformed officers could not erase the unease. Every shadow seemed to hide the figure of the man in underwear, every creaking floorboard a potential signal of his approach. The town, once filled with casual greetings and friendly waves, now moved with careful, watchful steps. Conversations among residents were dominated by speculation and fear, each theory more disturbing than the last. Investigators immediately began comparing the two cases, seeking any connection between the victims that could reveal a motive or pattern. Yet nothing obvious emerged. The men did not work together, did not share social circles, and had no apparent conflicts that might have made them targets. It seemed as if the killer chose his victims purely at random, guided by some invisible, sinister impulse. The absence of motive, combined with the bizarre appearance and demeanor of the assailant, only deepened the sense of unease. The police faced a daunting challenge: how to predict the actions of someone who seemed untethered from any rational explanation, someone who moved freely through the community, laughing as they inflicted terror. As news outlets picked up the story, the nickname "Smiling Killer in Undies" spread across the region, cementing the man's horrifying reputation. Residents spoke in hushed tones, sharing sightings and rumors, each account adding to the legend of a figure who existed at the edge of reality and nightmare. Ridgewood's quiet streets, once safe and familiar, became arenas of suspicion and fear, where even the most mundane activities felt dangerous. By the time night fell, the town was gripped in an almost tangible tension. No one knew when or where the killer would strike next, or if he would ever be caught. The second murder had transformed Ridgewood from a town of neighbors into a community bound together by fear, a place where the ordinary had been forever replaced by the extraordinary and terrifying. Investigators knew that catching the smiling killer in underwear would require more than standard procedures. This was not a criminal who followed patterns or left obvious clues. After the second murder, the police intensified their efforts, combing every street, interviewing countless residents, and reviewing hours of surveillance footage from traffic cameras, homes, and businesses. It was painstaking work, often yielding nothing more than fleeting shadows and vague shapes. Yet one small breakthrough came when a security camera on the corner of a quiet alley captured a figure moving quickly, wearing nothing but tattered boxer shorts. Though the image was grainy and only showed the man for a few seconds, officers noticed the peculiar confidence in his stride, the unnerving smile that seemed to stretch across his face. That single frame became the focus of the investigation, a haunting symbol of a man who existed beyond the ordinary bounds of fear. Forensic teams worked tirelessly at both crime scenes, carefully collecting evidence in hopes of finding something that could connect the murders to a suspect. The shell casings revealed a rare caliber of ammunition, one not commonly used in the area. It was the kind of detail that could narrow down the list of potential firearms and eventually the person who owned or had access to such a weapon. However, even this lead was frustratingly elusive. No registered gun owners in Ridgewood matched the profile exactly, and no purchases had been made in recent months that fit the description. Detectives were left chasing a phantom, a figure who seemed always one step ahead, blending into the ordinary world while committing acts of extraordinary terror. Amid the methodical police work, an anonymous tip arrived, bringing the first glimmer of direction. The caller mentioned a local man with a history of erratic behavior, someone who had been observed wandering neighborhoods late at night in minimal clothing and speaking to himself. Though the tip was vague and unverified, investigators couldn't ignore it. They began piecing together reports from neighbors who had seen strange activity, focusing on someone who appeared obsessed with firearms and had shown signs of deep resentment toward others in the community. Patterns emerged, small and fragmented. Yet together they painted the outline of a dangerous individual who thrived on fear and unpredictability. The town of Ridgewood, meanwhile, remained gripped by tension. Rumors circulated, stories of sightings and near encounters spread like wildfire, and the image of the smiling killer in underwear became a source of collective dread. Residents avoided certain streets, locked themselves indoors, and watched the shadows with suspicion. Every creaking floorboard, every flicker of movement in the corner of an eye reminded them that the threat was real, that the man who had murdered two innocent people could strike again at any moment. The town's once calm rhythm had been replaced by anxiety and vigilance, and even the simplest acts, walking to the mailbox, taking out the trash, were now fraught with fear. Police strategized, knowing that patience and caution were crucial. They mapped out areas the killer frequented, analyzed his likely escape routes, and coordinated patrols to anticipate his movements. Every detail mattered. Every observation could bring them closer to ending the nightmare. Yet the killer remained elusive, slipping through Ridgewood's streets like a shadow, smiling at the chaos he left behind. Each passing hour without capture intensified both the community's fear and the urgency of the investigation, as detectives understood that the next strike could come at any moment, and the stakes were higher than ever. Ridgewood slowly began to emerge from the immediate terror of those 2 days, but the sense of normalcy was fragile and haunted. Families tried to resume their routines, but the memory of the smiling killer in underwear lingered in every corner of the town. Parents walked their children to school with careful vigilance, glancing over shoulders and scanning sidewalks for any sign of danger. Local businesses reopened, though many reported that foot traffic remained low, and community events were postponed or canceled out of caution. The town's rhythm had been permanently altered, replaced by an undercurrent of tension and watchfulness. The images of the killer, his grin frozen in memory, became a recurring thought for many, replaying in quiet moments and haunting dreams. The police continued to work tirelessly, documenting every lead and revisiting the evidence, determined to ensure that nothing had been overlooked. Forensic analysts revisited the shell casings, re-examining ballistic patterns and trajectories, while investigators cross-referenced every tip and observation that had been gathered during the initial days of the investigation. Psychologists were brought in to analyze the suspect's behavior, trying to understand the mind of someone who could kill without apparent reason and smile while doing so. They suggested that he may have derived pleasure from chaos itself, a thrill-seeker who found meaning in terrorizing others. But such analysis offered no comfort to the town. It explained nothing about the fear, the randomness, or the shock of those 2 violent days. Memorials were quietly organized for the victims, small gatherings where friends and families could grieve and remember the lives that had been abruptly ended. Candles flickered in windows, and photographs were placed in public spaces, a solemn tribute to ordinary men whose lives had been stolen without warning. The town collectively mourned, but mourning existed alongside an awareness that life could never truly return to what it had been. Streets were safer now, patrols were more frequent, and the immediate threat was gone, yet the psychological scar remained. People spoke in hushed tones, remembering the way the killer had moved, the way he had smiled, the surreal nature of his crimes that had made reality feel unreliable. Over time, Ridgewood began to adjust, creating new routines and safety measures. Neighborhood watch groups were formed, security cameras were installed on homes, and community meetings focused on preparedness and vigilance. While these steps provided a measure of reassurance, they could not erase the memory of the smiling killer, nor the unsettling randomness of the murders. Media coverage chronicled every detail, keeping the story alive in public memory and cementing it as a modern cautionary tale. Ridgewood became known beyond its borders as the town that had faced inexplicable violence and survived, but the legacy of fear and caution lingered like a shadow over daily life. Years later, the story of the smiling killer in underwear continued to resonate. Residents who had lived through those days often recounted the events, careful to emphasize how ordinary life had been upended in moments. The town had rebuilt its sense of community, but the collective memory served as a reminder of vulnerability and the fragility of safety. Even as new generations grew up, the tale of the two violent days remained a story passed down, a lesson in vigilance, unpredictability, and the dark complexity of human behavior. Ridgewood had endured the terror, and though the killer was gone, the echo of his actions remained, a permanent mark on the town's history and the minds of all who had witnessed his brief, devastating presence. The pursuit of the smiling killer in underwear reached its climax in a tense, high-stakes confrontation that gripped Ridgewood with both fear and anticipation. After days of relentless investigation, the police had begun to narrow down the suspect's likely locations, tracing patterns in his movements and analyzing tips from residents who had noticed unusual behavior. Officers mapped out the areas he frequented, focusing on quiet streets, dimly lit alleys, and secluded parks, places where someone could move unnoticed and strike with impunity. Surveillance teams were stationed strategically, and plainclothes officers patrolled the neighborhoods, blending into the background while waiting for any sign of the man who had terrorized their town. Late one night, the police received a report of a figure matching the killer's description near a small park on the outskirts of Ridgewood. The witness had seen him moving through the shadows, his unsettling smile unmistakable even in the darkness. Officers quickly converged on the area, careful to maintain cover and avoid startling the suspect. The tension was palpable. Every footstep, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified in the silence of the night. The killer's presence was both a confirmation and a threat. He was out there, and the confrontation that everyone had been dreading was finally imminent. As the suspect was spotted, the officers moved with calculated precision, surrounding the area and signaling to each other with quiet gestures. The man in underwear appeared unbothered, moving with the same eerie confidence he had displayed in his previous attacks. His grin, unnerving in its calmness, never faltered. It was as if he had anticipated the police presence, as if the pursuit itself thrilled him. The scene became a tense standoff, a test of nerves between a man who had committed shocking acts of violence and those sworn to stop him. Every second felt stretched, the air heavy with suspense, as officers weighed the risks and searched for an opportunity to end the threat safely. Suddenly, the man made a move that forced the confrontation to escalate. He reached for a hidden object, and in an instant, the officers reacted. Shots rang out, piercing the night, and the figure fell. The nightmare that had haunted Ridgewood for days was over. The smiling killer in underwear, whose random acts of terror had shattered the town's peace, was finally stopped. Residents, watching from a distance, felt a mixture of relief and lingering unease, knowing that while the immediate danger was gone, the memory of the events would remain vivid. The aftermath of the confrontation brought both closure and new questions. Investigators secured the scene, documenting every detail, and the town began to process what had happened. Psychologists and law enforcement officers later speculated on the suspect's motives, examining his past behavior and mental state. They concluded that his actions were driven by a dangerous combination of thrill-seeking, disregard for human life, and deep-seated resentment toward the world around him. While these explanations offered some understanding, they could not erase the fear he had instilled or the randomness of his crimes. Ridgewood, though relieved that the immediate threat was eliminated, would never forget the intensity of those 2 days and the figure who had moved through their streets smiling at the chaos he caused.